Okay, well then, thank you for being here and welcome. This is the, I believe, third so far this fall of Language Dynamic Groups free webinars. In a series of these, we're going to do one every month, including into the holiday season. So September is special. It's National Literacy Month in the US, but also it's recognized internationally, and we'll get there. World International Literacy Day is September 8th, coming up next week. So without further ado, go ahead and get this started. I do want to mention that this webinar is being hosted by Language Dynamics Group. This is me. My name is Megan Kirby. I am a former special educator and behavior analyst in an outpatient setting. And now I am currently a PhD candidate at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Florida. And I am also the dissemination implementation specialist for Language Dynamics Group. It's a new role for me and for them, and I welcome you. And look forward to any questions that you may have about Story Champs following this presentation, or in addition to, and also welcome comments and questions in the chat. I like interactive and engaging webinars. So this is September. It's National Literacy Month, but I do want to point out that one of the four pillars, the fourth of 8 pillars for UNESCO is literacy and supporting literacy development from youth all the way up through adulthood around the world, especially impoverished, under-resourced nations. And what International Literacy Day is and what it will be this year. The goal is to explore how literacy can contribute to human-centered recovery. So if we think about what's going on in the world right now, and a lot of hot messes, right? We're going to need a lot of support as fellow human beings to try to tell our story and make sense and cope with what is happening to us as individuals or as a society. UNESCO also wants, so that's the United Nations, right? They also want to focus on literacy and how digital skills can be incorporated, digital programs can be incorporated to support literacy development, especially with children who may be remote learners. So anyway, we want to focus this month's webinar on capitalizing and celebrating literacy and the role that we all have to play in helping individuals learn to read, but also learn to love to read. Story Champs is our Language Dynamics Group, is one of our products that we sell, and it is an amazing curriculum. It's designed for multi-tiered implementation. It is a multi-tiered academic language curriculum. It focuses on teaching students, especially anywhere from preschool up to grade 3. And then if you have some learners with some special needs beyond just the grade level itself. And it supports teaching them the language they need to be successful in school, right? So what we know is that if you cannot read fluently or proficiently by grade 3, you are that much more likely to drop out of school and not graduate with a high school diploma. You have a higher risk, you're at higher risk of being incarcerated in your lifetime, usually end up in lower paying jobs, lower quality of life, just a whole gamut of other problems, unfortunately, that are associated with just not knowing how to read, and obviously then not enjoying reading by grade 3. So Story Champs tries to address that, what we might consider a school to prison pipeline, but really it's just, we're trying to develop a love for literacy in children's early years by reducing that effort, that response effort that it takes for children to engage in something that can be really challenging for them, right? And so if their first encounters with literacy can be something that is easy and fun, like narrative language, then this is what can put them on the pathway to success and into adulthood. So what we say is it's developed for diverse students in preschool and 3rd grades and like I said before, and beyond, because a lot of our programs and lesson plans that come with Story Champs, informational passages or expository text, we have lesson plans and materials and writing outlines and graphic organizers, all of those things on our flash drive that comes in Story Champs that are definitely being used with students, into middle school and beyond. So it's just not just for pre-K through 3. We have also designed it to be delivered by paraprofessionals or teacher assistants, teachers, literacy specialists, SLPs, especially SLPs, I would love it, and parents. And the reason why we say this and we stand behind it is that this means it's an accessible program, right? While we recommend trading in Story Champs, it is not a requirement to be able to implement it. The manual it comes with it. It's easy, it's got pictures, and also we have tons of free webinars on the website. We do offer individualized training programs for schools that purchase the kits, as well as for individuals that tend to group up. Like we have some speech language pathologists that will get together and then do a training online. So anyway, that is offered, and that more information on that is on our website. So when we get back to love and literacy, we want to talk about why do individuals like it? When I say individuals, children, why do children like it? First of all, it's fun. We go through some of the materials and the games that we have that are built in and explicitly programmed so that there's active student responding. So it keeps children engaged. Number 2, it's not a one and done type of language modality. What we do is we tell stories as early as I can remember. We listen to stories, we encounter stories. Reading a research paper is a story. You always have a problem, right? And then you have an attempt to solve the problem, and then you have some kind of resolution. Hopefully it's a good one. But everything is made easier through storytelling. And so when students encounter a familiar modality of language, it allows them to then focus on activating background knowledge, making personal connections with what they are reading or what they're hearing. And then also because it's an oral language intervention, it's easier for children to engage in. Narrative is more accessible for all the storytelling format, but also oral language itself is more accessible. What we'd like to say is you can't write what you can't say. And we have tons of research and lots of webinars that have been previously recorded and posted to our website that show evidence of the effects of oral language intervention on students' writing production, especially students where transcription is really difficult and handwriting is aversive. Similarly with texts and reading books, the response effort weakens the motivation of students who just look at books and are ready, don't want to engage in it and don't want to try because they see failure, right? Oral storytelling, not as hard. We also have interesting and conceptually rich stories. Within each story, we sneak in, but purposefully, pretty complex language, right? So it's an academic language program, but they don't know it. And so what we're teaching are these really difficult vocabulary words and grammatical and the syntax and language complexity, right? As well as the narrative structure. And these things are actually very useful. It's both the form and the function of this oral language modality, the narrative language itself, that is useful across different contexts. Not only is it useful in the school setting, but when you go home, you're not just going to check it at the door and not use and engage and practice this language. It becomes very useful when telling a parent about your school day. When they ask, how was school today? Hopefully we don't keep getting fine. We now are able to tell a story, maybe a little snippet about some random thing that happened, but it will have, a beginning, middle, and end in a sequence, because it's not considered work. When students find something useful and fun, it becomes reinforcing for them. So they're more likely to engage in the behavior. This is the kit. What comes in the kit in terms of physical, like things that you can touch, right? This is a snapshot of just some of the materials. There's a storybook. So in the center right there, big bold letters, storybook. And then there's illustrations for each story within the storybook. And those illustration cards are the picture sets that are right underneath that storybook there. There's the little boy that's riding a bike and he hits a rock and he falls off and he hurts his knee. And he goes to ask his mom for a Band-Aid and she gives him a Band-Aid and he feels better and he goes back out on rides his bike. Those cards are materials that are used in every single lesson. And those lesson plans, it's not just that we give you the stories and then the cards and then you're left to your own devices, but the lesson plans themselves that tell you exactly what steps to do and when to touch the picture and when to remove the picture and just use the icons. All of those things are on this little flash drive that's at the bottom of the screen here. And the manual as well. So the master lesson plans. We have writing activities and graphic organizers. We have, this is the best thing, and it was not planned for the pandemic. It wasn't even a thought in our minds. But on the flash drive is a digital presentation link, right? Or a format so that you can engage in virtual learning and remote distance learning with the students. So while the materials and the kit might be still in your office or at school, in your clinic, what ends up happening is can't go back there if we're under lockdown or the kids aren't there to do small group instruction. We have heard so many great things from teachers and SLPs who are delivering this remotely and are able to project the materials and the stories and the icons, and you can move them through touch. So yeah, just really, really funny that that was done in absence of knowing what was about to come. So there's also games that I referenced earlier on. Is what makes Story Champs fun? But those are games for active student responding. So you're going to see here, there's these little icons, and those are just for the storytelling. Those aren't necessarily for games. We have bingo cards, though, to the bottom right. There's some with 9 icons, and then there's some with just 6. So it depends on your learner and how quickly do you need the game to go. We also have some die. So the kids, they can be given a dice and roll it. And then we've got popsicle sticks that as the students hear, and this is great for a small group setting or even large group if you have enough, but if they hear the character in the story, they would hold up the popsicle stick. If someone else is telling a story, how we keep students engaged while someone else is taking a turn and telling their own story, like generating a personal story or retelling what they heard. We need something for them to do, right? So we don't cause behavior problems by forcing them to wait as we're really coaching this other kid to tell their story. The story games come into play. So the popsicle sticks and holding them up as they hear their friend or their peer have a story grammar part. Now, we also have our champs checks in large group settings, sometimes in small groups. So what I consider a large small group is 5 or more kids. We need to go through the whole lesson plan, and Champs Checks is a game, but what it does is allows children from the beginning. We have a lot of support in our lesson plans. We're adults, we model the answers so they get it all right, and then we slowly fade things out, right? But by the end of our session or our lesson with the students, they need to be able to tell that story, at least the recall, themselves, like independently. So we need to transfer stimulus control from relying on pictures and adult prompts and adult language to, by the end of that session, before they leave me and go out the door, go on to the next activity, they need to be able to tell that story by themselves. If you've got a lot of kids, again, like more than 5, for me, I would consider it like think, pair, and share, right? So you pair students together and they tell each other, they retell the story to each other, and they check off the presence of each of those story grammar parts in each other's stories. And when they're done, they can get a little trophy, but we call it champ checks. And then we also have story starter cards that can be turned into games, but those are also materials as well. So like I said, there's a lot of physical things here, so much more on the flash drive. Oh, center activities, so much more. What we also love is the community. So Story Champs, if you've heard someone who's used it, it's really a word of mouth thing. We're not doing a ton right now of huge marketing and media and visiting schools. And you don't find story champs in a like, product magazine, right, to purchase. It's all us. And really, most of it has been word of mouth from people who say it works, and then the research that we do, and then the boots on the ground, Mike, and then Trina and Doug, the developers, myself. It's really it. So, what makes it so great, in addition to all the evidence and the fact that it's liked, is that in early childhood, as well as, well, that's youth, so preschool up through grade 3, it is really, really critical that students have the ability to socialize with other students. As we know, this has been impacted with COVID and the pandemic and shutdowns and isolation. Collaborative learning is also a huge part for the development of adequate cognitive, social, emotional development, right? And there's tons of research that says that students who don't have these sociability and collaborative learning components built in to their programs, they're not going to succeed as much as if they were engaged in an intervention program that did have that purposely programmed. So the lesson plans always have chances for, or opportunities for, students to engage with each other, to contribute to the generation of a story together. And they don't really know it's work. So one of my favorite stories that Dr. Trina Spencer tells, she's the one of the developers of Story Champs, is that she went out and was engaging in a research project and was doing a lesson with a student. And then they turned to her when it was about time for her to bring the student back to their classroom. They turned to her and said, "You don't have to tell my teacher that we are playing if you don't want to." And it was a great sign that the student really didn't think of this as one of those pull out, let's do work, I'm going to test you. The child thought they were playing. And so this is one of those social validity measures as to, yes, it's an evidence-based program. It is effective up the wazoo. If you follow the lesson plans and the procedures, you get great gains. But all of that doesn't matter if the students and the end users don't like it. And especially if they don't find it fun. Kids will check out. Doesn't matter how effective it is if no one uses it, right? So the Story Champs sense of community, we get these stories all the time. And so those who are active users, we're constantly looking for opportunities to troubleshoot issues, which hasn't really come up. Mind you, with the pandemic, a little bit of a learning curve, but Boom cards, there's some SLPs that made those to help support the digital presentation. We have individuals who are coming up with new stories as we're generating them at Language Dynamics Group for future iterations of the intervention way down the pike. So honestly, it's a good idea for you to possibly think about joining the community. We do have a Facebook group and called a professional learning community. Another way for us to encourage young children, especially, but all children, to love literacy and not look at it as something to groan or sigh or really find aversive, is that Story Champs can create collaboration conditions, right? And interactional dynamics between children, even in distance learning. This is just a sample of, well, it would be blown up, but we have the digital presentation, right, of all the materials. And if you're using a basic story structure, level A is what we call it, but it has only 5 pictures and it has these story grammar markers or icons, right? We have all of those and you would click the link and it would give it to you. So if you wanted this story, then here's all the stuff for you and you can put it on your iPad. You can project it on a screen and parents can help the students drag and drop if necessary. And they're doing it in small group settings all the time. They're doing it in one-to-one settings for individual therapy. And there is word on the street that there are large group lesson implementation online. I have yet to see it, but I've heard it's out there. So I got to find those teachers. So Research suggests that storytelling activities carried out with small groups are the most effective. But again, we don't have the capabilities to only do that. And so um, the research really is only focused on implementation of direct instruction or programmed language interventions, but not a lot on narrative language or storytelling or oral language interventions. So because storytelling is an activity that's normally carried out like as a group, it's usually in person, right? It makes it easier for us to adapt and to a different delivery rather than face to face all the time. It's easier to adapt to an online presentation as we're getting more comfortable with Zoom or Teams or whatever you have. But also there's some people that do it asynchronously. So the construction of a story, students would be assigned certain story grammar parts and would be responsible for developing that part of the story based on what the previous student's contribution is. So for example, and this is why it becomes fun, it's almost like I think of Mad Libs, but I know that there's like a campfire game where you keep adding on to each other's stories. Well, think of doing so with students and asynchronously rather than live. Students are assigned certain story grammar parts and it gets passed around until you have a whole completed constructed story, and then the adult would write it up. And then the students actually could draw and contribute to the picture cards, right? So this would be narrative generation, and you can do those in a group setting. So, all right. Another reason Story Champs helps contribute to love for literacy is that it removes roadblocks to creativity. So when we think about reducing children's stress, when it comes to literacy work that they find or they think is difficult, it depends a lot on the reactions, right, of those in the environment. So if you hear some students sign like, oh, not this, or, oh, we don't want to read again, or I don't want to write, someone over here, Sally, who previously has no experience with reading or writing, it wouldn't be a bad thing. But when you start to hear some pushback from other students, now they have a negative connotation, right? And so we have to overcome that. Now, with storytelling, teachers really find SLPs. Let's just always assume that I always mean SLPs too. But really find that students are not as risk averse when it comes to tackling or engaging in listening and then retelling. They're not as afraid of making mistakes because they can't. We have certain built-in two-step prompting. We really don't want students to make errors in the retelling of a story because we don't want them to be frustrated. Storytelling is a ubiquitous activity and we need it for the rest of our lives. So why would we punish that by only teaching after they fail? So we do a lot of helping and prompting and prompt fading, right? So if it's just easier, we also get these writing outcomes. And I mentioned that previously, but we have experimental studies that show that kindergarten and first graders actually can improve their writing quality, so their text generation skills without any formal writing instruction, just Story Champs. And then we would collect writing samples and we have large effect sizes where students' writing just vastly improved, but we never once had to teach them how to write. So yeah, take that for what you will. It's awesome. If you want a copy of the paper, you can Google, both of them are free to access and free to read. So you can Google narrative writing kindergarten outcomes or first grade outcomes. But it's Spencer and myself as one of the authors, Kirby. Okay, so as I mentioned before, that one of, the cutie who thought that Story Champs was a game and not work at all. But play with a purpose allows students to engage in an activity with wonder or investigate their world. They get creative, right? And so compared to adult learners, children really need to be involved in more play and hands-on activities. You know this. Otherwise, just sitting there, you end up with behavior problems because they don't know what to do with their hands. Like they'll touch someone else, right? So it's difficult to recreate those things at a distance, especially when we go on to online or like we don't know if we're going back and forth and all of this chaos. What can remain consistent is that there's always these games that can be easily adapted and brought online, their games. So students don't really know that we're able to definitely hit in a certain sequence. Some explicit instruction is delivered, and we have consequences that we provide, whether it's a prompt or it's reinforcement, and ways that we can build up language complexity at the same time. So we sneak it in there, and they look pretty. Like, this is another thing. Story Champs is beautiful. We also play story jesters. So when we don't want to have things like popsicle sticks or die, there are some people like me who were a little bit risk averse ourselves to giving them out to students that we didn't trust, which is tisk tisk on me. I should have believed in my students. But we have story gestures. So like, this is feeling. So it's like you're crying down the side of your eye. Other kids can poke their eyes out. But these are, you don't need materials. So it's another thing. You don't need any materials for storytelling, right? You can take it wherever you go. You can speak, you can write it. And then especially with our story games, you know, we can take them wherever. If we forgot our kit, well, at least we can do story gestures. Character. More information on in the manual. Other ways that we can have fun and retell stories, when we want to extend our lessons and our learning, we do have family home connections, but those can be like work. So if we think about making storytelling fun, family history, we used to do it all the time. And now it's Facebook. So showing kids pictures, you know, on the phone, or if we actually have photo albums anymore, and creating stories out of what was happening in those photos, whether the child is in them or not. Or having the children come up with these stories on their own. They may not be true, but what do they think is happening in these photos? Always funny. I like those. Advocacy. So there are some students that really want to retell a story about something unfair, unjust happened. And then what can turn into, or that can turn into writing a letter. And there's so many other ideas, but there's one about pizza, there's a story about pizza, and then it gets the students to think about wanting free pizza. And so they write a letter to the principal. There's no rules. Movie recaps. So after a student or a young child watches a movie or a cartoon or some kind of episode, it's a great opportunity. It's a narrative frame. Great opportunity to have them recap that. And that's working on their oral language and their narrative structure. And we would give them help to encourage them to remember all parts of the story, the key story grammar. And same goes with TV episode summary. So students also learn early on that their stories matter. Okay, so wanting to teach storytelling, and we want to teach storytelling, and we want to actually like actively listen to the stories that they have to tell. If we do that, and we do so through active listening, students really, their personal experiences, it validates self-expression. So it says that they matter. Like, I will listen to you and I will remember, and I will bring up whatever you told me in a future conversation. These are the skills that make for great business skills, right? There's actually a place out in Nebraska called Boys Town, and Pat Fryman, Dr. Pat Fryman is out there, and I think he still runs it. But, you know, a lot of these students who come from really impoverished, under-resourced communities in LA, DC, Baltimore, all over the country, and these young boys, he likes to say that they're on this escalator downward, right? And they intervene, and then they get to go to Boys Town. Well, one of the things that he teaches them is to elicit stories from guests, these high rollers. Some of these funders of Boys Town will come for like a fancy dinner, right? And he will teach them to elicit information about themselves so that later on at the seated dinner, they will bring up those things that they learned through the stories that these donors told. They will bring up some of those things in conversation. And the next thing you know, these young men have jobs lined up for when they graduate. So if we think about, man, if Story Champs could just be in some of these communities we could learn the skills that could teach us to be savvy and create a sense of, wow, I feel important because someone asked me and remembered about my story, right? So self-expression and validation of our personal experience is super important, and it creates a love for learning. And like I said before, it's reinforcing. So if it works, we're going to continue to do it. So if we can continue to tell our story and someone validates that experience or says, oh yeah, makes a personal connection, says, oh, that's also happened to me too. Or if it hasn't, we'll remember and bring it up in the future. There we go. We've got another convert to the love of literacy through oral language. What we also know is that, the active student participation, the fun games that we have, the lessons and how quick paced they are. So there's active student responding, that really, if we don't get that early, it's unfortunate that it affects children's ability to initiate activities, to actualize their agency, really to acquire the knowledge of when to advocate for yourself, when you can make decisions, and then also when to know to ask for help. So when to try something first, and then when to ask for help after maybe you don't first succeed. Storytelling and the way we have Story Champs set up in terms of our two-step prompting, it allows children to context success so that they're not afraid of failure again, right? So participating in group setting and contributing to the makeup of a group story, or actually listen to each other's stories and then commenting on it, all develops that sense of community and really trust. We also use storytelling to help these young people explore their creativity and imagination. I think that's one of the nice things that we have built in, is that we have story starter cards, and those story starter cards have crazy illustrations, and it's wonderful to see what students can come up with and generate in terms of either an oral story or written, independently or together. And oh man, their minds are great. So it's not only fun for them, but it just reinforces our work as adults trying to encourage children to love to read and love literacy in general. So all stories, like I said before, all stories have some kind of purpose behind them. So children especially have stories to tell. Usually they're talked to. Let's back up. Toddler years, it's just all about them. But at some point, when adults stop asking you or talking about the things that you like to talk about, like that's what we do all the time with young kids. But the minute that kind of stops, other kids aren't doing that with each other. They want to talk about their egos, they're in their own little egos. And so what we can do is start to listen. When children get better at constructing a story, there's a lot of information that we can gain from it. We can learn both from the students and about the students. Their narratives can tell us a lot about what topics are of interest to them. So if we think about, especially when they aren't really great readers, they're not, gravitating towards books, and we want them to. But if they are great oral storytellers or emergent even, we can get the information about what they find interesting. What are the topics they keep talking about or bringing up? And then we can kind of guide them towards sections in the library or towards books that we already know that they're going to be motivated to attempt to open and attempt to read. And so that's going to help them find a love for literacy, but we got the knowledge without quizzing them, right? There's several reasons why we should teach personal stories. About 80% of our stories are personal experiences, right? It reflects how, the fluency, what kind of language complexity, maturity is in their spontaneous language. Is it rote? Storytelling will help loosen up some kids, especially on the autism spectrum, who can be a little bit rigid. And so if we train loosely, narrative language is the best for that. So we don't create little robots in our programming by no fault of their own, right? It's also socially important. Who has the most friends at bars? People with the good stories. So if we can teach storytelling, it opens doors also for social relationships. It's immediately useful. And then also paired with that is this natural reinforcement. So if something happens to you and you need to advocate for yourself, then this narrative language is the way to do it. Insert who did what in the problem, right? And then what did you do to plan or attempt to fix that problem? And then what was the consequence? You can think about all sorts of ways that people can report things that happen to them so that they can get help. But that's not on creating a love for literacy. That's on another webinar. So here's some ideas for kind of expanding and extending the games. If you have access to these microphones, the green mic that's on the right-hand side, you can get those at Walmart, or the left-hand side, the blue one, you can get on Amazon. They're both under 20 bucks. Horror stories in the reviews from parents because the kids love them so much, but they're not that little echo plastic chamber anymore. We've moved beyond that. And if you have any other tips for microphones, please let me know. These are the two high rated ones that I get feedback on. Personally, have not bought yet. So then we move from, okay, we've got oral storytelling, it's reinforcing, it's fun, all these things. And then you get into, okay, well, I found out that my students or these children really love the topics about cars and dinosaurs. Two easy topics that most kids aren't interested in. But so I can get some books on that. But when are we going to encourage them to write stories? And really storytelling and story champs in particular helps create the kind of community where students can then share their writing. They can collaborate with different audiences. So students have different backgrounds. Different adults have different backgrounds and experiences. So we can also connect kids on our caseloads or in our classrooms to the wider world because everything is on social media these days. So we can publish student work on a blog. They can make a video. You think about it like mini Hollywood scripts. You never know. So there is a group, just mentioned briefly, that is in LA and Los Angeles, Young Storytellers Foundation. Super cool, but they pair up people like Hollywood industry folk to volunteer and go into school and teach kids how to write stories to then be performed, right? Super cool, but it takes the concept of storytelling. Unfortunately, they wait till students are older, right? So if we can get them younger and they already have a love for that, then writing isn't as difficult to get the kids to want to write. All right, so here's an example because I keep bringing up the story starter cards. So this is a story generation lesson plan, and this is an example of the lesson plans that we have. And the step-by-step, it's almost a task analysis for us as the adults so we don't mess up. And over time, you don't need these anymore. But we have the kids generate orally a story if they pick one of these at random or they vote to select one of these illustrations, and we put it up and project it. And then we assign story grammar parts to each kid. And one by one, we take the information in order, in sequence, and I will write up the narrative, and then they learn to copy it. So there is definitely not only a scope that we have in Story Champs, but a sequence. And when you get students to certain parts, and when would they be writing on their own? Not at step one. So this would be like step one. They're just going to copy down what they produced orally. Again, you can't write what you can't say or think. So that's where we'll start first, and then we'll work on the written generation next. And then finally, some of these story generation or personal story generation extension ideas, these come into play with, okay, if we want to get students to continue to love literacy, so it's not just, okay, read, now we're at the reading to learn part, which we always hear is the most difficult. Learning to read and then reading to learn. I would argue that they can still learn to read, into their older years. I still am, as a PhD student, learning to read, how to read research articles. So it's not like a definite cutoff. So we need to make sure that we incorporate fun activities just as much as we do and games and such with our very early learners, right? Our, pre-K through, I would even say like grade 1. But as they get older, we tend to neglect some of these things to make it fun. So personal story generation to extend these story champs lessons, or let's write about our travels. So this would be something like from the summer or a break. But some kids don't go anywhere, so they can't write about travels. Some children love video games. Well, develop a plot, a narrative for a new video game. And fan fiction, they like certain graphic novels. Well, you have to do a spin-off. And so all of these things still require narrative structure, right? And now we're going to be building on the linguistic complexity that they use in these narratives, in these written narratives. If we're doing it orally as well, I can transcribe the information that they are going to give me orally. And then we'll work on the handwriting another day. And then podcasts, love this idea where we have young kids otherwise wouldn't be given the autonomy to do these things, but parents usually help. And be surprised as how many parents actually do help and love this, but creating a podcast and a fictional one. So after they create these stories, then can we create a podcast episode with the story that they generated using a story starter card? And so again, sharing their stories with the world, that context reinforcement, and then reinforces the fact that language is awesome and it's fun and it helps us connect with other people and we're not as lonely and it makes sense. And we share experiences. And although I may never get to experience what you experienced, now I have it in background knowledge because I listened to your experience. So it's just a great storytelling. Love it. But it's just a great way to help children develop this passion for wanting to learn more and wanting to know more, to be curious about the world. And so I really think that that is an essential part of why Story Champs works, as well as creating a lifelong love for literacy. Okay. And on that note, I'm going to call it for this month's free webinar. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. You can also send me an email. Be more than happy to answer it. And yeah, that's just it. Thank you for joining.